being invited. We really appreciate being invited into this conversation. As the topic says, our focus today is equity in place-based economic development, which was a topic that emerged in the discussion we had with Sarah around an area that might be of interest to this group and aligns with who we are as an organization. So we'll introduce ourselves more in a moment. Sarah already called out each of the team. I'll just ask them all to wave so you know who they are. There they are on the Zoom, and you'll hear from each of them as we go through this. I'd also like to highlight this is set up as very interactive. So you'll see some slides up now, they'll come down so we can chat. We've got some polling questions. This is really an opportunity, hopefully, to have peer-to-peer exchange on what we think is a really exciting area of work. And so with that, we'll go straight into a poll if that works. And so we have 3 polling questions, which are hopefully going to pop up for everyone on their Zoom. If Mike's magic will work right now. There we are.
So the poll should be live in the window.
It is live. So question number 1, what is the stage of development for your equity plans and strategies? So for those of you who are in a Build Back Better coalition, this might be where is equity within your overall coalition plans. For those of you whose coalitions has evolved since the initial process, you might be answering more within yourselves and your region's economic strategy. Still under development, nearly complete and moving to implementation, or actively in implementation. Is everyone seeing the poll?
We're starting to see answers coming in. We'll give everybody a minute here to take a look and fill it out. And once we get to a good kind of representative number of responses, we'll close it out.
And Mike, can they see the second one as well?
They should be able to see we're getting responses for all 3 of the questions.
Perfect. So the second one really is to tease out is there broad alignment and responsibility and metrics around equity, which is your first option, or is it sort of all on you as the equity champion in your coalition, or somewhere in between? And then lastly, what might be holding back equity in your work or in your coalition right now?
So we've got responses from about 60% of the folks on the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll, and I think for those who are filling it out, give it one more go, and then I'll close it out. So can you see the results now?
I can, yes. So this is great. So it's heavily skewed towards still developing the plans and strategies for 60% of folks, but a nice healthy group has already moved into implementation. So I think that's really valuable insights for RTI and for the community of practice, just to know that quite a few folks are still developing the plan, but those who aren't are already very deep into implementation. So really kind of split group. When we look at the responsibility, I think that's very encouraging that there is broad responsibilities shared across the coalition for more than half of you, for a quarter of you, many, and for the remainder, just a few. But we don't have anyone saying sort of it's all on one person. So I think that's really encouraging as well. And then down here, I think as we'd expect, pretty evenly split, but with one really clear winner. Organizational capacity and team bandwidth is one of the biggest areas holding things back. but closely thereafter followed by coalition dynamics, which we'll talk about more, and some unclear strategies in this area. And I don't know, Mike, are you able to see some of the long answers that folks put in the other?
I am trying to figure that one out, because several people did add others as well.
All right, well, we can just put that in the chat as it comes.
I will.
I'm sure folks will be interested to see that as well. Great, so if we go to the next slide, Sarah already kindly introduced ourselves, but just to give you the overview, we are New Growth Innovation Network. We usually go by our acronym, which is NGIN, and we are a knowledge, insight, and innovation hub to support practitioners advance inclusive economic growth. And we do that in particular by creating greater prosperity for people of color, for women, and for neglected geographies. And you'll see this sort of teased out through our presentation. This is how we define equity. This is our focus when we talk about inclusive economic development, is these three categories, really primarily because that's where we see the most economic disparities, economic exclusion, sometimes economic disenfranchisement, where we see that more efforts need to be made. We do, however, recognize that each region defines equity and focus areas within inclusive economic development differently. And so we'll talk more about that, but that's us and that's how we work. Another question that often comes up is, what is inclusive growth? And I think it's really important to try and define it. And you'll see here a definition about what it aspires to do, but not a prescription about how to do it. And so to be clear, inclusive growth does two things. One, it should and must deliver regional growth. So your economy should be growing with these strategies. But two, and importantly, at the same time, it should be reducing economic inequality, and so we believe very much that these are two sides of the same coin, and that when done well, they are mutually reinforcing. We're not the only ones who believe this. There's a lot of macroeconomists out there who have done substantive research to show that in the long run, these approaches do build more resilient, more sustainable economies, and that this is an optimal model for long-term economic growth. I think we just try and define it in maybe more practical terms and ways that we might all on this call be able to action in our regions. One important thing around how we define it is we really put an emphasis on assets, with the notion that many of us in our regions have a lot of hidden assets, ignored assets, untapped value in local economies, where we aren't seeing some of the human capital that's there, where we aren't seeing some of the neighborhoods, the physical assets that are in our regions, and that by better engaging individuals into our economic vision, we can drive a more robust economic growth. And therefore, that is how your economy both grows as well as reduce inequality. So we're actually going to pause already now to get some of the peer-to-peer conversation going with two questions. And the first one is, how has your region defined equity? We recognize that a project in Utah or Kansas might have very different definitions than a project in Hawaii or urban Detroit. So we'd love to hear how you're thinking about that. Feel free to put up your hand, write comments in the chat, whatever is very comfortable for you. And second, did you discover any assets in your region through your process? And here we're specifically talking through your equity development process that you have completed or that you're still doing. Did you discover any assets that you hadn't really considered before that you'd like to share with the group? So we'll put the slides down just for a minute and if folks would like to share to those two questions. There's the first discussion question in the chat. How did your region define equity in your plan or framework? Or maybe it's still in process. That's okay as well if you'd like to share early definitions.
I know when we at RTI, when we were engaging, we first started our work in July last year. And I know when we we read all the 60 applications to get a sense, and it really was really interesting to see how the different coalitions addressed equity. I don't remember all the details in this moment, but I know that some strategies were much more around inclusion, and some other strategies, so including a lot of times it was either populations that had been excluded, or communities. So a lot around rural communities, for example. So if it was an urban area, proposing their concept being much more intentional about including rural areas or peripheral areas into the industry cluster growth strategy. That was, and then I remember there were also some very clear ideas around, we have centered equity in our work for 50 years, and this is just 50 years, 100 years, what have you, and this is just an ongoing way for us to do this. So it was a real range. I had a mini dream before we got really busy about being able to better kind of document that, not for the sake of documentation, but really to share just the incredible diversity, and because it also shows that regions are just in different places, and diversity really does truly mean different things in different places, and acknowledging that.
Anyone else feeling comfortable to share how they tried to or are still trying to answer this question for your region?
Hi, my name is Ricky Ellison, and I'll chime in here really quickly. Some of the things that we've been looking at really have been surrounding the evolving needs of our communities, and making sure that we're not just blanketing with solutions. And so we're taking an equity stance in providing what is necessary and what is needed for a little bit more of an individual basis. And then one of the communities really that we've tapped into that was unexpected was really our human resource departments for our, we're kind of focusing in on manufacturing. And so, tapping into those people have really, brought to light some of the different plans that we can start to kind of look at when it comes to equity in our employment, and how we are really looking at professional development, looking at growth opportunities, and really starting to kind of individualize those plans instead of, the equality approach, more of that equity standpoint, and really bringing that to light.
Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that, Ricky. And which region are you in?
Thank you. Kansas, Wichita, Kansas.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hey, this is Sarah in North Carolina. And one of the, we're trying to address a variety of aspects on the equity opportunity list, if you will, but the geographic inclusion of distressed rural communities is a real focus for a lot of our projects. The challenge with us for also manufacturing is, how do we bring folks into training opportunities and potential employment opportunities when some of the big employers are not and may not be proximal to where they are living at the moment. And so we're very sensitive in North Carolina to think about trying to expand place-based new job growth in the future, and then being sensitive to people that want to stay either where they live, or if they're going to a college with the anticipation of moving after. There's different types of folks that we're trying to bring into our talent pipeline. So some of the folks in our university program, our HBCU and HAIU program, probably expect to move from their hometown. Our community college network is different. You have both folks that want to stay exactly where they are, and that's the value of having so many community colleges in our state, particularly those included in this project. Meeting people where they are. And so we're thinking a little bit about all of that, both rural and economically compromised from COVID in any other region, right? Or any other reason, excuse me. And then we have what we think is the first HBCU coalition of new hubs, folks that have not historically been engaged in training around life sciences manufacturing. So we're building out brand new hubs and trying to leverage all of the positives that come with that, equity and otherwise. New universities, new types of folks, new student populations, new faculty, across all the different dimensions of equity. And so those are a couple of things we're thinking about, both current and near and long-term future talent pipelines, if you will, but then also figuring out how to balance our regional and economically depressed counties or communities with where the jobs are at the moment, and trying to also recruit or grow companies in more rural or suburban areas, not just in the middle of our urban core. Thanks. And I know there's a couple folks online, if they want to say anything more to the North Carolina model or not, that's fine. Thank you.
That's great. I want to just appreciate Ricky and Sarah's contributions. I think they uplifted a couple really interesting points. One was that there wasn't a consistent model that was applied in both Kansas and North Carolina. I think that's the point. EDA certainly gives that flexibility to define equity according to regional realities. And to allow you guys to do the work that you do, which is look at your data, look at your situation, and identify where you want to put focus. I think the other thing that got lifted up by both Sarah and Ricky's comments was some of this untapped assets, right? It came up as engaging human resource managers, engaging talent pipelines from HBCUs, getting down into the details to segment between community colleges and other universities and HBCUs. And so really engaging the fullness of your economy as you think about talent. So I think that's a great example of inclusive economic growth. I see one more comment from Ben before we move on to the next couple of slides. Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I'm driving, but I guess I had more of a question than a comment. I believe that our coalition took an approach of trying to evaluate and adopt inclusive projects that could be more project-based inclusivity through very strategic fellowship programs and training programs, and trying to look at workforce development opportunities and from a startup ecosystem, making sure that there's good inclusion metrics there. But it's very project-based, and it is outside of an actual regional inclusive growth strategy from an economic development standpoint. And I was wondering if you had, if that was a something that was seen in other communities, or if that, to me, it seems like it's a missing piece of that from a regional economic development professional standpoint. We're trying to basically say that we are having an inclusive growth strategy for our cluster, but it's outside of the context of the regional economic development strategy.
I think, Ben, your point is a super thought-provoking one, which is around do we bring equity into the core of our day jobs as economic development practitioners, or do we add it around in the the fringe from 5 to 6 p.m. or 8:30 to 9 a.m. And if we are only able to do it on project level, sort of why and what holds us back to that fullness. I'll put up a slide, which I think you won't be able to see because you're driving, but I will try and do a good voiceover, which really talked about how we saw economic development practitioners engage on equity. So obviously some have thought about it for a long time, and it's been really core to their strategy, but many really started engaging on this either when they saw the national racial reckoning that came about from the murder of George Floyd, or because of the federal guidance on equity and a need to meet that. And so what we saw in the last 2 years is in particular was that EDDs, or economic development districts, or EDOs, tended to approach equity in three ways. So one was looking at the organization, and they looked within their own organization at who they were hiring, at their talent. Some of them looked at their board, they looked at their DEI statements, but it was a very inside and inward looking effort. And so for some of them, that's what they were able to take on and make as much progress as they did or didn't, or are still making progress and efforts there. A second group really tried to embrace equity and place-based development through planning. And so we saw that either they looked at who and how they engaged with community organizations in the SEDS process, or they looked at to what extent the plan itself deeply incorporated equity considerations. And so I think this gets to a little bit of Ben's point. Was it sort of side projects or was it core? And the process itself, obviously, if community voices, community groups are engaged in a very token way, sure enough, the economic strategy is really left wanting quite a bit, and you're not engaging the fullness of assets in your community. And so we have a lot of resources on that. Sounds like you're going to have a dedicated webinar on that, but that's been a really important kind of thread. And finally, the third group was all in on the actions and strategies. So that's where they were getting into small business strategies, inclusive cluster strategies, spatial infrastructure projects. And here they were actually looking at how to embed equity in their core economic set of activities within their SEDS or within their economic plan. So that's how we saw the sort of groupings play out. And I think, you know, on this call, there'll probably be folks in the spectrum of buckets. If we go to the next slide, please go ahead, Ben.
I'm sorry, but could you define what you mean by core activities?
Yeah, we have a toolkit that we're going to share at the end of the presentation, and we have sort of 5 buckets that we talk about. So we talk about inclusive clusters, we talk about small business support. I think you know, for some people it will be business attraction and retention. So it's really, I don't know if you sit in an economic organization or university or somewhere in between, but you will have your core set of economic activities and remit for which your agency is responsible. And so organizations that we see as like sort of all in on bringing equity into their efforts have found ways to look at equity considerations across all of those strategies. So it sort of depends on what your current remit is, and then applying it across those core strategies.
Thank you.
Let's see if we can go to the next slide. That's it. So this is kind of a very broad framework we have. We call it the 5 levers for inclusive economic growth. I hope this will be sort of a valuable thought framework for each of you as you think about the work that you're already doing on equity, which sounds like many of you are doing a lot of great work already, but perhaps how to increase impact and deepen impact in your regions. So we have 5 areas where we really believe that you can pull a lever to advance more inclusive economic growth. And conversely, if you sort of don't do anything in these areas, you're either sitting in neutral and very much under leveraging the assets you have in your region, or kind of going in reverse. And we think over time will lead to reduced growth in your community as well as increased inequality. So the first lever, which already came up from 2 of our speakers, is human capital, and really thinking about the talent that you have in your community. And just to give you sort of a few examples, we have an example that comes to us from Kansas City. Actually, I know we have some Kansas folks from a different part of the state, but Kansas City has certainly done some very interesting work with KC Rising, which is a civic entity which brought business leaders together and really had meaningful dialogue between business, K through 12, universities, and also thinking about adult learning. And so I think it's been a very powerful story on ways to really, I think, more robustly around human capital and be more inclusive and intentional in that approach, while also being very targeted in the industries that were prioritized for that region. We have another example from Kentucky, There's a Kentucky Regional Planning and Development Agency, which serves 7 counties right outside of Louisville. And in their 2023 SEDS, excuse me, they develop specific goals and metrics related to workforce wraparound services, especially childcare.
Sorry about that. Yasmina is battling a little bit of a cough. So I am a little less familiar with the exact examples that Yasmina was talking about through the work that we have done, but the human capital, financial capital, innovation infrastructure and small business ecosystem, and of course, civic infrastructure and spatial or physical infrastructure are the 5 levers, as you can see on the screen that we talk about, and happy to sort of engage in the conversation on how each of these contribute or sort of interact with the economic development system, and how that how inclusion is can be centered in each of these pieces. Yasmina, are you feeling okay to
I think
jump
I'm
back in?
back. We'll find out. Thank you so much, Swati. So financial capital, I think Swati already covered well, but obviously there is a lot of philanthropic capital out there that's very interested at seeing more equitable practices being brought to the center of our work. And I think this can be paired with more public and for-profit capital. And we do know that inclusive economic strategies need aligned capital sources to really accelerate. And so being thoughtful about where we might find some of those capital sources to meet our strategies and plans, I think is key. The third point, I think, is really the heart of this group, is the innovation infrastructure, and really thinking about how you line up and build bridges between the different groups and entities that are in your community. We know, for example, with small business ecosystems that we often have very broken social connections between our different small business communities. So we might have a women's chamber of commerce, we might have a local chamber of commerce, we might have a Latino chamber of commerce. But what we saw very clearly during the pandemic was that resources were not flowing equitably to each of these groups, and that the social connections and bridges between these groups were insufficient. This really plays out in innovation infrastructure, where we've seen that as cities attract high growth, innovation, high tech industries, that we often lose diversity in the workforce in those particular segments. So I'm based down here in Miami, where we have a very diverse workforce, but sure enough, as we started attracting some of our higher growth, high tech innovation jobs, we saw decreased diversity in those sectors. And so really thinking about how we build partnerships between different educational organizations, between different reskilling and upskilling organizations, and then the small business, I think, is a very powerful way to expand supply chains and really, again, think about how we engage the fullness of who's in our region already. You heard the example from North Carolina about more rural communities. You heard the example from Kansas about diversity as they defined it. So that might be more Black suppliers and business owners, Latinos, whatever that might be in your region. But we know that these social connections are not always in place, and really thinking about how to build bridges is a powerful way to expand your region's growth, but also close some of those inequities. The civic infrastructure really gets to maybe the point Ben was getting to, which is how we build partnerships with community organizations and who's at the table, and whether that's the real table or whether that's a token table. So really thinking about how we bring community and neighborhood organizations into regional economic strategies where they don't always get a seat, or if they do, they have a small voice. This is another powerful way to unlock more growth. And finally, physical and spatial infrastructure. Obviously, there's a lot of work right now on digital equity and digital access, but we know certain parts of cities or certain parts of our region and rural communities don't have the same level of transport infrastructure, digital services, et cetera. And that has a big bearing on our workforce and business owners' ability to get access to these economic opportunities. So I apologize for the cough halfway through, but hopefully between Swati and I, that made sense. These are 5 levers that can be pulled and to accelerate inclusive economic growth in your region. If you're not looking at these 5 areas, we would humbly argue, that you're leaving value on the table, that you're also not bringing the fullness of your community into your economic strategy and vision, and that in the long run, you'll not be able to grow as fast or be as resilient. And so with that, I turn it over to Swati, who's going to kick us off for some discussion questions, and we'll bring the slides down.
Thank you, Yasmina. I did see a couple people trying to jump off of mute. So if you had a question or a comment related to the 5 levers, maybe you want to sort of state that now before we get into the more detailed sort of peer-to-peer exchange. Okay, maybe that was just transitioning out of that section. Great. So in the next section, what we wanted to do is really hear from all of you about how you are thinking about equity in your work. So the first question, and we put this in the chat as well, in thinking about equity in place-based economic development, thank you, Betsy. What challenges are you facing in your region? Like, what are those things that are still proving to be a barrier to advancing equity? It is still tripping up, whether it is organizations coming together, it is leadership sort of aligning, resources that are aligning. It can be really a lot of different things. And the part 2 of that question is, what opportunities are you excited about in moving forward? So 2 parts of the same question. What challenges are you seeing right now in advancing equity? And what opportunities are you most excited about? And if you would like to share something from your experience, I would say, you can raise your hand and we would love for you to come off of mute and share it with the group.
We can also save this for when we quit recording if we want to pause and bring it up in a little bit.
I can jump in real quick. Again, this is Sarah at North Carolina. One of the challenges is that our life sciences manufacturers need to hire a lot of people. They have current and projected job openings. And so they're super committed to working with us to meet the spirit and the commitment of our Build Back Better Regional Challenge projects and coalition, while also recognizing that they need to hire people. No matter if they fit exactly the profile of the target populations we're going after with the grant. So we're, working to make sure that we can work together as much as possible to make sure those talent pipelines and new hires reflect the folks that we're targeting. And so that's part of it. I think something that makes us super excited is that the community engagement work that we've started and the partners that we've brought on board and some of the connections that our training partners, I won't say them here in case they want to step up themselves, but that we have, very targeted Latinx outreach and really connecting with ecosystems that already existed in this space. And so trying to leverage some success that already is started in our state by other partners and bring it into the mix with us. And the response that we're getting from some of our support organizations and populations that we're starting to engage with is really, really positive. high energy, very interested. They hadn't heard about these opportunities before, et cetera. So I think we're tapping into some really great new ecosystems to blend with life sciences, to blend with really strong training programs. And then, of course, we'll support the needs of our industry partners. Thank you.
And that is really sort of, sitting at that intersection of you've got to do it at a certain speed, you've got to do it at a certain scale, but the intentionality forces you to go slow, be more cognizant of what needs to be done in order to sort of support those people who haven't had the support and haven't had the opportunity to engage with the system. So thank you for highlighting that. Ben, I saw your hand go up. I'm not sure if you're able to share or want to share.
Sure. I'll just say, I think our low-hanging fruit in many ways was the human capital side. We're developing a lot of training programs that have and our training programs are spread across 16 different training providers and or workforce investment boards that are all having outreach strategies and stakeholder engagement opportunities to make sure we hit our rural. I think the other 5 levers that you all described are a little bit more nuanced when it comes to trying to establish a robotics or AI startup ecosystem for the BIPOC community, because there is a narrow, population that have the capacity or expertise to start a robotics or AI company, and then, narrow that down even further by, establishing a minority or woman-owned business strategy for that. Participation is going to be hard just by pure limited volume of individuals who are able to take advantage of some of our startup ecosystem resources, though I don't think anyone has done a comprehensive audit on how those resources are deployed holistically across systems or across clusters. And then I would say from a business retention and expansion element of our strategy, we have been partnering with our SBDC and additional resource providers to support supply chain diversification efforts across different organizations and trying to include BIPOC companies in our ecosystem supply chains. But I will say that I feel like we, and those are all great, and they're going to be great levers. I just think that holistically we need to, we can be very satisfied and check all of our EDA requirements, frankly, if we rest on our fellowship, our trainings and all that stuff. But to your point earlier, I don't know if our project fully dives into how we can fully adopt and leverage the other levers that are described, and therefore, because no other project lead has taken it upon themselves to lead the inclusive effort of the cluster strategy, I think that then does fall on the RICO to do it, and then to suggest that the RICO has the authority to introduce those types of stakeholder engagements while also trying to facilitate the implementation of the other 5 projects could be a challenge.
Thank you, Ben. And it is. Go ahead.
I'll just say, if you guys are open to establishing as I mentioned to Sarah, we may need to subcontract and expand the consideration of establishing an inclusive cluster, like an inclusive growth cluster strategy above and beyond the projects and programs that we are implementing in order to fully leverage it. And I just don't know if beyond NGIN, what other resources we should be looking at to build that up.
I see your, there is in the chat, there is some alignment with what you're proposing, Ben. So that might be a way forward. Thank you so much. I do realize that this is for an hour and we're coming up to about 13 minutes left in this hour. So maybe just transitioning over to Betsy and Dee to talk about the toolkit. And then we also might want to leave some time for questions at the end.
And Swati, can I just observe one point? Because Vanessa, you kindly chatted a few thoughts in the chat as well, and Ben, but there's something about coalition dynamics which we should not ignore. And I think Ben is saying, is it all in the RICO? And Vanessa, you're saying, I don't want to overstep, but I really need this information. And so this is really, I mean, we've kind of put that question provocatively around, like, is it about the money? Is it about power? Is it about decision making? Like, this stuff really matters, right? And these are relationships that we hold in our region, which are going to endure beyond this project, and how we engage and push forward progress on some of these points is not always straightforward. So I just want to affirm that point and acknowledge that it is, a work in progress to get many stakeholders on the same page and rowing in the same boat. I was encouraged in the poll how many of you said that you did feel there was that shared responsibility. But as we know, shared responsibility and shared delivery and outcomes is different, right? And so I'm sure you're working that through in your coalitions and sort of pushing for those outcomes. So thank you for that point. And Ben, we can certainly try and communicate to Sarah Lawrence and the RTI team around, what resources might be out there if you are feeling that a more, deeper and comprehensive inclusive cluster strategy is needed.
And just to jump in really quick, we can also, like, these ideas are great. And we can, as I mentioned to Ben too, as a community of practice, if there's a shared way for us to provide supports, perhaps through this process, that's something that the community of practice can do. We can't do 60 in-depth strategies, we'd love to, but that is something that perhaps we, Vanessa and Ben and others, we can get your input in terms of how we could perhaps guide a process that's relevant to everybody, but obviously leaves you open and are connected to other resources to kind of go much deeper with that process as well.
Honestly, if I may, real quick, and I'm sorry for just jumping in, but if there was a RFQ or RFP template that would be developed for a scope of work to develop a inclusive cluster strategy, honestly, that by itself would be a huge help, because the scope of work with your insights of best practices across countries and other resources, just having a definitive, because we all have to do RFP and RFQ processes to meet our requirements. If there was a standardized RFQ for various levels of inclusive growth strategies, whether it's, one of the levers strategies or all 5 levers, however you all would define it, but even just having that would be a big help.
I hear you, Ben.
I don't know if we have a example RFQ in the toolkit that I'm about to share, but we do have a section on inclusive clusters. And I know that we'll definitely think about that a little bit if we've seen anything similar to what you're putting forward, Ben. I just want to go ahead and share a little bit more about the toolkit in the hope that it might be a resource for all of you. About 2 weeks ago, we officially launched our Inclusive Recovery Toolkit, and it's the culmination of the insights and learnings from NGIN's 2-year Inclusive Recovery Initiative. And it really serves as a set of ideas, examples, and resources intended to support regional economic development leaders in elevating equity in their organization in their planning and in their implementation. So those three areas that Yasmina mentioned earlier, it lines up with that directly. And it's in particular focused on the economic and sort of how do we embed equity in the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the toolkit was created with the support of the Economic Development Administration and in close collaboration with the NATO Research Foundation, as well as informed by peer-to-peer discussions, technical assistance projects, and interviews directly with economic development districts. And so I just want to say that the audience we crafted these tools alongside were economic development districts specifically, and the toolkit itself specifically mentions comprehensive economic development strategies, CEDS, which if you know CEDS, you know CEDS, and they're big. And the resources in this toolkit are much more broadly applicable, though, for economic development organizations and strategic and economic development planning processes. So where you see CEDS, think about sort of broader economic development plans as well, since a lot of those components carry through. So you can access the toolkit at recovery.newgrowth.org. The toolkit is an online interactive web page with several core sections, and then an idea bank where you can search and filter all of the solutions that are within that toolkit. So you can easily narrow down and identify what's relevant to your region. And if you are a reader and you prefer downloading and reading through the content, the whole guide in its entirety, you can also download that on the website. So the toolkit has three core areas that we heard from economic development leaders, those three areas Yasmina mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to quickly touch on those sections and then turn it over to my colleague Dee to share a little bit about how you can identify resources relevant to your region in the idea bank. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for any Q&A that you have. So our first section is the organizational commitment and capacity. So this is, as Yasmina alluded to, everything that's happening within the economic development organization. We heard from many economic development organizations that taking steps internally to address equity was a really key component. So this included diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, practices, and statements. And by taking steps to address this internally, it allowed for that work to then be embedded across all elements of their planning and development and how they allocate funding. And so from interviews with these regional organizations, the NATO Research Foundation found 4 key action areas. These included the crafting of diversity, equity, and inclusion statements and plans, steps to address equity within the organization and how that then translated to communication with the community. And then lastly, how to leverage the data and those information assets that the organization holds. Beyond just what's happening inside of the organization in terms of policies and practices, one of the primary, if not the primary area that we heard economic development organizations were using to incorporate equity in their work was in their planning. And so for economic development districts, it's their CEDS. However, they're relevant beyond these considerations are relevant for any economic development plan. And one of the key things that we learned across the 2-year initiative was how important the planning process specifically was, and meaning all the engagement that led to the actual creation of the plan itself. So finding ways to embed equity in the community engagement, in partnerships, and being transparent about the process. So everything from who is on your advisory board to what opportunities were there for key communities to intentionally provide feedback. And so that process piece is a really core piece in the toolkit because it reflected a lot of the conversations we had from economic development leaders. Beyond just the process, though, we also did include sort of like, how do you ensure that equity shows up and in the document itself, in the ultimate plan? So everything from how do you describe the demographics of your community to what are the metrics you're using to indicate success to make sure that you're building in that accountability within the document itself as well. So this section of the toolkit, Equity and CEDS, has examples, resources, and tools to help you think about how are you elevating equity within that planning both process, but in the plan document itself. And then the last sort of third core section of the guide looks at how we translate all of that planning and all of that internal organization work into strategy and implementation, into action. So we have 6 core sections that we heard from economic development organizations that were really key and primed to address equity gaps. And these were the 6 that Yasmina mentioned earlier. So these include equitable community engagement, small business support, inclusive clusters and industry strategies, equitable infrastructure, which we define as including transportation and digital and broadband access, ecosystem barriers, which we define as housing and childcare as core pillars, and then lastly, equitable workforce development. And so within each of these 6 areas, you can drill down for additional examples, tools, resources, and considerations to help you identify what makes sense to addressing equity gaps in your region, knowing that not every region is the same. And so with that, sort of a preview of the content, I'll pass it along to my colleague Dee, who will share about the very exciting idea bank that aggregates all of these resources. And Dee, I think you're on.
Rookie mistake, but good afternoon. I know this by now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Betsy. I'm excited to be here. I'm also excited to see some of my colleagues from my current city and from my former city. So I really hope this resonates with you. If you have some questions, reach out to us. But I want to talk a little bit about our idea bank. And in the toolkit, we have brought all of the tools, examples, ideas together and put them in our idea bank. And this bank includes more than 100 inclusive recovery ideas that you can filter out through topic. And a core component of this idea bank is examples from 35 economic development districts and organizations. And while most of the examples are from economic development districts or organizations, a lot of these examples come from cities and states, and they span from more than 20 states across the country. So you will find something for you. And if you don't find something for you, come and get us. You should bookmark this guide. You can access it at recovery.newgrowth.org. Can you repeat that back to me? Yes, thank you. We are eager for your feedback and engagement, and we want to see how you can continue to bolster equity-focused, inclusive growth in your region. And, you know, so far I've been really hearing and listening, and I'm glad that our toolkit will be able to maybe help you with your questions. And it's been wonderful hearing about how so many of you are already taking steps to advance this work in your communities. We hope this toolkit and other things that NGIN provides are of great value to you, and it's a great resource to you. We welcome any feedback. Don't hesitate to reach us out directly or reach out to us directly. Our information is in the chat already, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I think NGIN, is that the official? Okay, good. I didn't want to good timing, Dee, and you bring amazing joy to the end of a webinar. So I just want to thank you for that punctuation. I know we're at the top of the